Are you a life science professional? Stay on top of things and keep up with the rapid changes and innovations within the industry. Value Do engages with experts and peers on various life sciences topics. Join Life Sciences Value Share today.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We have Michelle Werner again with us today to do the third of the three series episodes that we are doing on the topic, the evolving world of oncology. So the first two episodes we covered, what it means for the patient, for the HCP and the payer. And the second episode we covered a more inward look of how to, manage an oncology business unit, if it's a big pharma or a small pharma, or even how to stand up an oncology business unit. So we heard some kind of good stories around what all to, consider as a leader, as a US leader and a global leader. And then what are the capabilities? There's some good stories that we covered. Today's topic, today's episode, we are going to cover the go-to-market approach. And I was going to ask you, Michelle, I think it's okay if we cover the launch aspect of the go-to-market, because we may not be able to do a lot of justice to the entire go-to-market approach. But before that, welcome back, Michelle, and thanks again for taking the time and joining us.
Thanks, Gaurav. It's great to be here again and great to see you again.
Likewise. So do you agree, Michelle? I mean, do you think we can do better justice to the episode if we just cover the launch aspect of the go-to-market?
Let's do it. I love talking about oncology launches, so this should be fun.
Super. All right, let's just jump in. Why don't I just hand it over to you and say, how do you introduce this topic to the listeners and the viewers? Oncology launches. What comes to your mind?
So, there are a few key things that I think are really important, and for me, it's very much about speed and agility and keeping things simple, but also making sure that you're thorough in places where it really matters. So those to me are the key things that I would say for any launch that we've done in the oncology space is really what I encourage my teams to really, really think about. How do we go fast? How do we be agile, react quickly to what's happening in the market, especially as you're going through that launch phase? How do you make sure that you're not overwhelming your customers, but keeping things really simple and focused on what value your medicine is truly bringing, but then making sure that you go deep on a couple of key areas that are really going to make an impact for your customer.
Sounds good. So let's start with, I think we touched upon this topic of the oncology world. Oncology launches are not just one-off brand launches that you launch a brand and you then forget about it and it's an autopilot. It's like a launch happening today, a month later another indication getting launched, 2 months later a third indication, and then before you realize there is a line change, from second line to first line. So let's start with that. How do you feel about that, because you've managed a lot of those situations?
Yeah, and I think one of the key things to think about really is, how do we look towards when you're launching a new asset like this, think about having the end in mind, even when you start at the beginning. So for example, you talked about perhaps having one product launch, but oftentimes today in the oncology world, one product launch really means the launch of a franchise. Because one product, as you mentioned, could go for a couple of different indications. It could go for different tumor types. It might be in different lines of therapy. It might be both in early as well as in metastatic. And you really have to have that big picture in mind, even when you come out of the starting gate, because that's really where you set the tone for that brand that will stick with it for the duration of its entire life. And so while you still want to be focused on doing a good job for whatever the new introduction is at that moment, you always have to be mindful of, how it might be setting the pace or setting the impression, or taking that position in that customer's mind. And I think that makes things exciting, but also a little bit trickier than perhaps it was when we launched oncology medicines many years ago. Usually
Right.
maybe 2 lines.
Yeah. No, that's a very important point you make, Michelle. I think takes me back to our old days when you kind of almost set up a design and made a deliberate effort to launch the franchise when we were just thinking about one brand. And everybody was thinking, why are we doing separate efforts to set up a franchisee plan and a franchisee launch, and then separate efforts around the the upcoming brand launches? What are the couple of learnings or the best practices you want to share? What is the benefit of doing that, and how could we just how could the oncology leaders orient themselves around that approach? Because it's difficult, right? You're almost doing 2 jobs where you are taking the accountability for the franchise as a leader, but then you are also helping the marketeers, prepare for the brand. And then there's this alignment between the two, as if it's an umbrella brand and a brand. So, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say definitely, approaches that we've taken before in the past is really to think about the things that can and should perhaps be done in parallel, but also making sure that you're really clear about the things that need to go across regardless of what indication or, patient population you're serving with each launch for any particular asset. So, of course, there are some elements that extend across, right? The image of your brand, the brand name, the hallmark, the look and feel, like all those kinds of things are going to be the same. But at the same time, you don't want that to be a distraction from what the teams really need to do in order to be able to go deep on the customer insights that are really important to make sure that you can connect your product to the needs of the physicians and the needs of the patients within a particular indication. Because that's really where you're going to have the best opportunity to help provide that information that is ultimately going to be used to decide whether or not to prescribe that medicine. So it's about really figuring out what you want to be able to do in parallel, things that cut across, and then what can be done sort of in channels side by side with each other, but then making sure that you have those connection points all along the way so that there's enough transparency and visibility and quite frankly, some shared accountability, but still having people that are really focused on the key priority areas where you're going to really make a difference. Right. And I think that's one of the key things that, I've certainly learned along the way makes the difference between having a successful launch and not.
Okay. Yeah. So, and can you exemplify with a couple of things that could be common, at the franchise level, so that things that could be almost, we could have a framework for all the upcoming launches, or the template or the playbook that is common, and then specific areas where you say the marketeers need to, do their own heavy lift on the brand.
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly some things, like, for example, patient support programs, which will probably be consistent across multiple indications, how you approach certain, let's say, payers or channels, which would be consistent across different indications, all of which I think, can be leveraged no matter what tumor type, no matter which patient population or line of therapy it is that you're going for. Mm-hmm. But there are certain things when it comes to, really thinking about how do you tie the data associated with your brand and your medicine to the actual customer needs. So a lot of the insight generation really wants to go deep into the, really what I believe is the emotional behavior that ends up driving prescription behavior within when treating a certain patient type. And it's different. Like, it's different when you're talking about breast cancer patients and you're talking about lung cancer patients. Mm-hmm. And it's really important to understand the nuances between that, So you can decide how to choose which elements of your data set, which elements about your product characteristics are going to be most meaningful for that customer when you're talking about this particular patient population. So those are the kinds of things that I think you really have to get really specific about when it comes to each individual launch, and won't necessarily transcend as much from one launch to the next.
Right. And is there, and I may be oversimplifying here, but is there, it's almost like an equalizer approach when it comes to functions as well. For franchise, there is a setting that you set up for, let's say diagnostics, it has an appetite. I mean, obviously some kind of areas have appetite and some don't. So do you suggest an equalizer approach where you say, the functional element is higher for this, but there is this sort of a template that we have for the franchise, but it kind of keeps on changing, and marketers should be aware of that, and they should not just kind of get carried away with the franchise approach and then not really do justice to the brand.
It's actually interesting that you use that analogy. I've never thought of it that way, but I actually really like it, and I think that's absolutely true. I mean, because we know for a fact that even with the same medicine, I mean, you may have, one indication that includes a biomarker and one indication that doesn't, right? And so, just in this one example that you just shared, I mean, you have to be able to, and this is, I think, where that second kind of category thing that I mentioned that really drives launch success is the agility, right? It's like, depending on the type of indication or the nuances of that indication, certain things are going to be more important. Certain things are going to be more relevant. You may be entering into a very competitive indication in one place, but less competitive in another place. That might mean that you need to focus more on, let's say, share of voice and differentiation in one, less of that in indication number two. Same thing like you've just said, perhaps in one indication you have a companion diagnostic that might not necessarily be used across all the indications. And that, then means, okay, well, we need to also be investing in what it is that we need to do do patient identification and embed testing behavior, especially if you're first to market, right? And so that's where I think that agility really comes in, or this equalizer analogy, as you've mentioned, which I think is a really nice way to put it. You may have to pull different.
So, Michelle, let's. I think you bring up an important point. A few seconds ago about being first or second to market. How much does that play, or how much should that play in a commercial organization's mind? I have seen some leaders getting too carried away with that sort of mindset of first to market or second to market, and then they are over analyzing the numbers to see how can we kind of be better in a horse race, and then some just accept it and then play it accordingly. So where are you at with that mindset, and what do you recommend?
I mean, so let's first take a step back, right? I mean, sometimes you have the ability to influence whether or not you're first or second. Sometimes you don't, right? I mean, I think generally pharmaceutical companies strive to be as fast as possibly they can. Sometimes they make it there first. Oftentimes that's not the case, especially not in the oncology world where we're in these days where you have so many different classes of drugs and so many different competitors within a class of drugs. Now, what I would say is I do think order of entry to market makes a difference. There's no question about it that if you're first, some things are a little bit easier, but also some things are a little bit more difficult, right? Because the burden is on you when you're first to really shape the market, to really, let's say, embed certain behaviors that might be brand new, to think about how do you use, maybe mechanism A over mechanism B, and that shift can be quite difficult for some customers. And how you approach that type of situation is fundamentally different than if you're second to market or third to market, where you're actually just shifting, instead of product A, you use product B, right? So you're less about shifting the behavior of, what class of agent or, some aspects of the physician behavior. You're really trying to swap out a place in the mind of how do you be better than the agent that came before you and ultimately be able to serve patients the best possible way. And so I do think the way that you approach those launches and those market conditions is different. But what's really important, especially when you're not necessarily first to market, I still think that you can be a market leader. I still think that there are opportunities where first in class doesn't mean best in class. And in fact, it often doesn't mean best in class anymore, where next gen agents are oftentimes much better than the first gen agents within the same class. For me, it's really important to not think about the order of entry, but more stay focused on what's your differentiation?
Right.
How are you going to uniquely carve out that space for your medicine in the minds of the customer? And that's what I think is really the most critical. And what I would say is I actually see it oftentimes, like we don't spend enough really thinking about what's the differentiation, because that's how you're going to win. And it's also important to keep in mind that the differentiation for medicine can, of course, come from your attributes or your data package that supports your medicine, or the attributes for your particular medicine, if it's a different dosing schedule or regimen. But it's also in terms of the entire package that you're bringing to support that medicine or patients who are receiving that medicine, or the support that you give the customers. So those are further ways that you can differentiate, especially in very crowded fields, that can help you overcome the order of entry challenges that might happen if you're later to the market.
Right. No, that's very insightful, Michelle, and very kind of different perspective. It's almost like people do not like to challenge that. They still believe order of entry is one of the key criteria, and it's a bit of an old school marketing sort of concept that people are not ready to let go of. But changing gears, let's jump into the launch itself. So how do you want to kind of talk about it? Do you want to talk about it through the pre, peri, and post-launch sort of a thought process, or do you want to kind of do a functional view of it, that in marketing, market access, and medical? How do you want to kind of go about?
Well, I guess I'd rather do it in phases, because I think that's how we think about it, right?
Yes.
From an organizational perspective. And of course, each function has roles to play in those phases, but those functions have to work together, right? Based on what we talked about in our last episode,
right? To
really make sure that each phase goes according to plan. So I think that makes the most sense, Gaurav.
Okay, cool. Let's jump in then. Let's talk pre-launch. And you may want to kind of slide in some of the non-oncology experience, because I know we are covering oncology, so let's talk oncology primarily. But there is a difference between a non-oncology prep to launch versus an oncology prep to launch. So we'll talk about that as well. But let's hear about how do we prepare for a launch, and how early do we prepare?
I think that if you take it from a global perspective, we're talking about preparing for launches, easily 3 years out, right? This is where you start really laying the groundwork. You make sure that your clinical trials are designed in such a way to help ensure that you've got an optimal data package to support the commercialization efforts. And so it starts pretty early on there. From a market perspective, it's a little bit later, really 12 to 24 months, depends on the size and the complexity of the market or the complexity of the medicine. But that's really where it all begins. And what I'd say, is the most important component of that pre-launch phase. And again, it's independent of function. It's really the insight generation. It's really all about understanding the environment, being able to really know what are going to be the major drivers for making certain decisions around different treatment behaviors, et cetera, how things might be evolving, of course, not just with the introduction of your own asset, but within the entire landscape that's around you, and how you might need to plan today to adapt to those as and when they come.
The scenario planning,
but it's really,
are you referring to the scenario planning or?
Exactly. It's the scenario planning. That's exactly right. And really like understanding the possible things that could happen and be prepared for them. But it's really the insights generation, because all of those insights is what's going to help you make decisions today that you'll then be executing on when you're in your launch phase.
Right. So is there, I know, this is more of a very fundamental question, but is there a thumb rule around how much time should we have for a regional launch? Let's say for a country like US or one of the top 5 EU, that we should have this much time if you want to do good justice? Or do you think it's working backwards?
Changes, right, Gaurav? I'd say, really, you'd really like to be able to give yourself a good 18 months in order to be able to prepare.
Okay.
Fact of the matter is that sometimes you don't have 18 months,
Correct.
Right? Sometimes you're operating off of a much shorter time frame for a variety of different reasons. Either the regulatory pathway gets accelerated for some reason, or maybe you're in licensing an asset and it's already late stage and there's only, you've got to do all the prep work based on when you in license it. So you don't always have the luxury of time. And so this is where I would say the most critical thing then is to prioritize. Like, think about the things that are really important. You might not necessarily be able to get everything perfect, but you want to pick and choose the things that are really, really going to matter. Right. So for example, if you don't have a lot of time, listen, I'm a marketeer at heart, right? But at the same time, I also recognize that whatever image you put on your visual aid is not what's going to make a difference to sell your drug one way or the other. So it's interesting because marketers love doing campaign work, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the campaign that's going to make the difference of your launch being successful or not. So sometimes you can easily fall into the trap of spending a lot of time focusing on getting the right picture, getting the right imagery. Like, that's not going to be the big difference. I'd rather get the messaging right. I'd rather focus on, what are the 2 or 3 things that I really want physicians to know about my medicine, rather than them being able to pick out what's on the cover of my visual aid. Because if they know what my medicine's all about and what the key things are to understand how to use it and why, that's what's going to make them prescribe 9 times out of 10 when they're not looking at your product. So,
yeah. And that's almost one of the key aspects, how you can operationalize the agile principle, right? I guess with that, and if you can prioritize at that level and let go of some of those second priority items, and then in the first place identifying what is second priority and third priority, and then going with the first priority items. Agreed. So pre-launch, prepping the organization, prepping the market, and prepping your customer, and prepping the brand. What is most important to you? If you were to kind of say this one is much more important, or it's okay if you feel that everything is important, but at different times.
I don't think everything is important. I actually think that the more and more work that you do with your customers, that you can do with your customers prior to introduction of a new medicine, is probably one of the most important things. And this is why, as an organization, we invest quite a lot when it comes to our medical affairs capabilities, especially in that pre-launch phase. Mm-hmm. Making sure that we have investigators, clinicians who are enrolled in our clinical trials, that they have experience using the medicine, that they're thinking about, which patients to be using it in versus others. When they have some hands-on understanding of the clinical benefits based on their experience in a clinical trial. This is something that's really, really important to give them confidence at the end of the day in the medicine as when it's introduced. And so I really think about at that point in time, making sure that you're investing heavily when it comes to your medical affairs resourcing, especially in that pre-launch stage. So I think that's something that I don't think that we can really underestimate. The other thing that I think that we really have to be prepared for is to make sure, especially when you're introducing a new medicine, or it doesn't necessarily have to be the case when you have subsequent indications, and it depends on the country, is that you're really preparing your payer channels at the same time. They understand that a new medicine is coming, that maybe they have to reserve budgets in order to be able to anticipate that a new treatment paradigm might be changing. And so there's work that can be done there to make sure that there's awareness and familiarity, and that they can anticipate and plan for it on their end as well. And then the other thing I would say, maybe thirdly, but also really importantly, is about this market shaping component, which you mentioned as well. And this is really where I would say it's really important to make sure that you don't underestimate the, I would say maybe the lack of clarity in the minds of a physician about what the unmet need is in a particular disease area or for a particular patient population. And all of the market shaping or market preparation work that we do oftentimes is trying to help shed a light on what those unmet needs are, and to make sure that there's awareness of what we already know exists, which is dissatisfaction in the way that clinicians, are treating patients today. Sometimes I think that we all, can get very complacent when it comes to, well, we have our tools in our toolkit and we know exactly how to use that. We don't actually think that we need a different tool in order to be able to do what it is that we do every day. But the fact of the matter is that, if you realize that the tools that you have aren't necessarily working as well as you think they are, you're really ready to think about, okay, I've got to tackle this problem in a different way than I've been tackling before. What do I need to do? How do I need to think about that? And that's often a lot of the work that we do through our market shaping activities. And I think it's really important because it helps prepare people to understand where the introduction of new technology and innovation might play in the treatment landscape.
No, that's helpful. And that kind of, and again, I may be wrong here in articulating this question, but have you come across this sentiment that, we are not going to invest too much in market shaping because let others do it. I'm going to put my money in marketing, in the promotional dollar. Do you want to reflect on that a bit? What do you feel about that?
Well, I feel like I've had to come across this many times in my career. And actually, I will agree that in certain circumstances, it makes sense to do market shaping. And I think this is especially critical when you're first to market in either, it might not necessarily be first in class, but if you're the first introduction in a certain patient population, you might have to be the one that shoulders that burden and does that work. Right. You may not have to do that, though, if you come later to the market or if you're second in class and in a similar indication. If, for whatever reason, the treatment landscape has moved on as such that unmet need isn't necessarily as critical to shine a light on. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve and what the market conditions are at that time as to whether or not that's going to be necessary. And I think it's a choice that every business needs to make to see, is it something that could pay off, that we believe there's a need to do and that we should invest in it? Or if you do something like that, are you just preparing the market for maybe a competitor who might be there already, right? So I think it really depends on what the conditions are on in the market at any given time.
Sure. So I think this is a good segue. Do you think we should move to launch itself? What does that look like, and what should that look like? Is there something like a great oncology launch versus a good oncology launch?
I think there's definitely degrees, right, in how successful any launch would be. But I think a lot of it really, I mean, the most important thing that I would say that I always keep in mind when you're launching a new medicine is you basically have about 6 or 9 months to launch. And at that point in time, if you've done a great job, you'll know it. If you haven't, you might not be able to recover again. It's very difficult after the first 6 to 9 months to recover. So you really have got to be thinking about the launch might come from your approval, or it might come from reimbursement in certain countries. But most of what's going to have determined the success of the launch will have already happened in your pre-launch phase, right? So that I think is really critical.
Right.
What I say is so important when it comes to the launch phases is to really make sure that you have your customer model right, that you know who your key customers are, that you've had them prioritized, that you understand who are the capabilities, the functions that are going to be most important in order to be able to address the needs of those customers at any given time. And actually, at the end of the day, it really comes down to how well you execute. Being simple on your messaging, making sure that you get out in front of your key audiences multiple times in the early phases of your launch, and to also make sure that you're really focused on just getting them to try. Sometimes I think we go through launches where you're striving to be, number one in the market. You're focused on making sure that you get every single patient. But the fact of the matter is, every single patient doesn't come at the beginning of the launch.
Correct.
You really have to start somewhere in baby steps. And I like to focus on execution that is all about building trialists, getting trial, multiple physicians that are willing to try. But then instead of actually trying to expand your physician base to get other physicians that are willing to try, get those trialists to try again and to try again. Because what happens then is you start getting that momentum from a launch, right? And then you start having the groundswell of belief that this is an important product, that it's changing the way that I think about treating my patients. And when you start creating momentum that way, this is where I think that you have the most successful launches. So it's really about focusing very narrowly on how you execute, what the small, I would say, micro milestones are in a launch, those really critical key performance indicators at a launch. Yes, of course, you've got to look towards like the big picture and what you're trying to achieve, if it's market leadership and share of a total market. But it all starts from a couple of physicians starting to try. Right. And the more and more we focus on that, and the better we get at that, this is where everything else starts falling into place.
Yeah, that's very powerful, Michelle, and that's almost like a preference and a model versus. I've never kind of thought of it this way in the oncology world. So I've not heard leaders speak like that and have that confidence to kind of go with that model, because there's a lot of management pressure to go against that model, right? I guess to do breadth and frequency and expand. So I think this is I'm sure it's pretty close to your heart, this entire kind of model of just kind of going to a few trialists and then creating that momentum through that epicenter versus kind of doing a carpet bombing effort. So while we are talking about execution, what are the couple of other things that come to mind, that you feel are great execution, building towards launch, let's say close to the launch period? Cross-functional collaboration, does it even matter
it does.
Launch, or is it already too late if you have not?
No, it really does. I mean, especially when you're working on certain medicines. I mean, like, let's say, for example, you're introducing a new biologic. It needs to get on the formulary. If it's not on the formulary, it's not going to get reimbursed, right? So there has to be a well-orchestrated machine of the various stakeholders who are really important to make sure that launches go well. So it's not just what your sales force is doing to get the messages out around about your business, but it's also to make sure that your field access personnel are working to make sure that the reimbursement for your medicine is well underway, that your medical personnel are working to make sure that the data packages are where they need to be in order to make sure that drugs get listed on the formularies, et cetera, right? Like this all has to happen in concert with each other.
Right.
And then let's also keep in mind when you're introducing a new medicine, maybe you also have a diagnostic, you've got to figure out how do you get a test, how do you, like what lab do you need to use, how do you get reimbursement for the test? Like there's all kinds of things that come with this. And there'll be many questions in your clinician's mind that will probably be hurdle, that they're like, oh my gosh, it's too overwhelming to even think about like doing something different than I was doing yesterday.
Right.
And so for me, the way that I see our role within in a pharmaceutical company is to really think about the roles of the people within our go-to-market model that are really all about how do I remove that hurdle? How do I make sure this hurdle goes away? Like, how do I make this just a lot easier for the customer so that experience is positive and that it's not, that those barriers that would get in the way of them adopting a different technology aren't really there. And the way that this has to happen is through constant communication in an appropriate way across all the teams.
Right.
To know, okay, like, I know that they have a patient, they've prescribed, and that patient needs to go through, prior pre-authorization to make sure that the drug can get reimbursed. I know I need to speak to get the field reimbursement manager to get connected to this customer so that they can help. Like those things have to happen. And it's really like in the moment that these decisions really need to be, and these actions really need to be taken in order to make sure that those barriers get pulled out of the way for the customer.
But that said, Michelle, I think I want to kind of highlight a best practice that I kind of learned from you. You are saying that you can do it in the moment because you may have not done that proactively earlier, and that's why we are kind of going through a scramble model. Whereas what I'm reminded of is how you almost like 12 months before the launch, you brought in all the leaders from medical, from marketing, from market access services into the room, put a patient journey, a customer journey up there. So where are the hurdles? Where are we engaging? Why are we engaging in a duplicate way? And I remember those very rigorous, very difficult conversations, 4-hour long conversations, but then asking those 50 questions that will make sure that we are going all aligned and as a team, so that one, we are not sending multiple messages out and then you're not bothering the customers with medical saying something and marketing saying something, but it's the same customer. And then, but also being agile with the launch, so knowing exactly that we have a plan that we are, delivering from versus, it becoming like a siloed approach for the same brand. So, I think that's why it was a trick question. I said, is it too late or not? Because I wanted to bring this up because you made sure that this is a deliberate part of the design, the launch design that happens 9 months early. But if you miss that bus, you're saying you still can scramble through it, but still do a better job of the launch versus just not doing it. And then, that would be a good launch versus this can still be a great launch.
Well, I think you're right, but I think it's also why I said, by the time you get to the approval or your actual launch date, like the trajectory for your launch is probably already set, even before you're out in the market, because it has everything to do with how you prepared. So exactly that example that you shared, Gaurav, like really getting all your key stakeholders on the same page to understand that they know exactly what they need to do, that they're all fired up and they're ready to go and they're ready to respond in a coordinated fashion. You're right. That happens all before the launch. So that you have your first patient on day one, hopefully, that it's just about going through the motions because it's all been identified what those motions need to be in advance.
Oh, cool. Anything else about the launch itself, Michelle? Or I would love to definitely cover the post-launch, because that's when the companies lose momentum, thinking that they have done their job. It's out of the door. But anything about the launch that you want to kind of talk about?
I guess the only other thing that I would say is really important to keep in mind is it is really critical to be very focused on like how things are resonating once you actually get out there, and to adapt and change if you need to. And sometimes I've seen turning a blind eye on the things that aren't working and not addressing those issues even in that launch phase, which then creates bigger problems down the road. So I think it's about yes, being committed to your strategy and your go-to-market model, but it's also about, having that agility, listening, learning, course correcting if you need to, and not being afraid to make a change if that's what's required. So I'd say that's really important in a launch as well.
Any example that comes to your mind, where you course corrected and you felt, that this was not a part of the strategy, but it's a good continuous improvement?
Honestly, at the end of the day, I think there's lots of examples where you just continue to iterate. And I think part of it really comes from, let's say you figure out what your key messages are that you're going to be launching with. And again, it's about keeping those messages simple and clear and easy to remember. But I also think a lot of the learnings come from how exactly you tie those messages to what's going on, to individual patient types that get discussed when you're talking to a customer. It's those learnings that are really like the gold, right, in a launch that you can then leverage and say, this really worked because it made a lot of sense in the minds of the clinician. And it's about really saying, okay, now that I understand that hook and that connection, it's about making sure that that's pulled through and how it is that you execute from one customer to the next. And so I think those are definitely things that you iterate, and I'd say fine tune along the way to make your launches even more successful.
Cool. Well, that's good. Anything about post-launch? What's your 30,000 feet view on post-launch in oncology world? How are people doing it, and are they doing it correctly? Is it fair, or is it good, or it's bad?
So I would say, again, when you're thinking about, I don't know, I mean, in the oncology world, post-launch to me, hopefully you're not necessarily in a position where you're really post-launch, because if you're doing a great job with your launch, you have continuous data generation, you have continuous new indications, you have, lots of different things that you can carry on, re-emphasizing the importance of your medicine, maybe applying it to a new patient population over time. Like, you could be in this launch phase essentially until you have loss of exclusivity for your medicine. The best launches in oncology are like that. So you aren't necessarily sort of falling into the that zone of, well, you've been out there for 4 or 5 years and there's no new indications or no new data. You're essentially in harvesting mode where you can kind of, just relax a bit more. And I don't know, we don't see that as often in the oncology space anymore. Right. And I think if we do our jobs really well and we have continuous stream of data generation over time, you can continuously be bringing new data and value for customers and patients.
Right. Now, that said, how do you pursue, besides data generation, how do you pursue let's say for nomenclature's sake, the post-launch, so once you've launched one product and we know, there are like 3 indications coming up, that we may kind of file for, the first line where currently we are in second line. So how do you pursue that phase? Is that any different, or is it just that the way you approach the first launch?
Well, they're definitely, you have to make some choices, right? Because obviously you have to decide, where in the treatment landscape do we really expect this medicine to be used, or in the treatment paradigm that we expect it to be used. And maybe it makes sense to talk about certain indications versus others, maybe, right? So you've got to be mindful about how you're going to shift from one place to another with the introduction of new indications. And so that's definitely something that you need to make those choices, because it won't make sense, in the whole life cycle of a medicine to cover it all, right? You'll want to be able to pick and choose what's really the priority. Where is it that you're really intending for your medicine to be leveraged, and to make sure you're focusing on those areas and getting it right. So there will be some shifts in terms of your resourcing from one place to another, and your effort that you make from one place to another over the course of the life cycle of a brand.
Right. And do you think that the operating model could be the same, or, besides the resource adjustments, or do you think the operating model also needs to be revisited when it comes to follow-up indications?
It might be, right? I mean, so for example, at the beginning of a launch, it may be really important, let's say, especially we've talked a lot about targeted therapies, right? At the beginning of a launch, it may make a lot of sense to really talk about the importance of driving testing awareness, testing behavior, patient identification. But at some point, and again, if you've launched well, that patient identification gets incorporated into the standard of care. And you may, and hopefully what we ideally would be striving for is that you get reflex testing upon diagnosis of a disease, and then you wouldn't have to talk about that anymore, because every single patient will get tested in their patient journey at the right time, and then that information would be used to make a treatment decision. Now, it may not make sense to keep talking about testing if you've got 90% of your patients are being tested, right, upon diagnosis. So yeah, I think that your operating model could change, because some of those key criteria or key factors that were really critical at one point in the life cycle of a brand may not be as critical anymore as you move forward.
Right. Cool. So yeah, no, I mean, I want to keep going, but I know, I have to respect your time and viewers' time. So any final thoughts, Michelle, or anything that you felt I did not cover when we were covering this subtopic of, oncology launches? Anything that comes to your mind?
No, I guess it would just be to maybe reiterate the point that, launches are, I guess, a period of time where I call, controlled chaos, because there's so many different things that have to happen basically in tandem with each other, that it could be chaotic if it's not well coordinated. But the controlled piece is really important, right? It's really all about how do you manage that? How do you be focused on what your priorities are? Make sure that you're not trying to do too much, and to really focus on doing a few things and doing those few things well. And I think that's really what makes, a good launch a great launch.
Sounds good. No, thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us, and lovely talking to you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Pleasure seeing you again, Gaurav. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Life Sciences Value Share with Gaurav Kandari. We invite you to visit valuedoconsulting.com/podcast for additional resources and to access the notes to today's episode. Join us again soon and invite your peers and colleagues.